Jeffrey Epstein died in a federal jail on August 10th, 2019. Days later, bags of shredded documents were being hauled out of that jail. A corrections officer called the FBI secret tip line said they had never seen this amount of shredding, said it was suspicious. An inmate was told to carry the bags to the rear gate and throw them in the dumpster. The inmate said they are shredding everything. This is what the Epstein files just revealed. And it gets worse from there.
There are many different stories about Jeffrey Epstein and the government response to his case, but this one is a real doozy. The Miami Herald's Julie Brown, who you might have seen on this program, has an absolute bombshell about how the Epstein files show there were an unusual number of bags of shredded documents removed from Epstein's jail just days after his death. That alone is suspicious. A corrections officer, though, was so concerned that they called the secret FBI tip line and said they'd, quote, never seen this amount of bags of shredded documents coming out to be put in the dumpster. The officer was concerned about the after-action group that came in to look into the death. Just to tell you how this works, usually investigative teams do not immediately shred documents and evidence, they collect evidence. The FBI records state that the caller found it, quote, suspicious that an after-action team charged with investigating would be shredding huge amounts of paperwork. That is an understatement. A corrections officer later wrote a memo to the FBI saying you might want to investigate why those employees are destroying records. And jails sometimes use inmates for certain physical tasks. The Herald reporting an inmate at the jail was told to take bags of shredded material to the rear gate, throw them in a dumpster. The inmate said, reportedly, quote, they're shredding everything. On top of that, the files show that there were whistleblower accounts, a letter to a judge, and U.S. attorneys' staff who also viewed this as suspicious at the very least, a potential crime or obstruction at most. Molly and Maya are back with us. When you hear that the feds and investigators are the ones doing the shredding, what does that tell you?
Something ain't right. That's my formal legal opinion on the matter. Now, this is really how can I say it? An astounding story, astounding, to have investigators actually, first of all, anytime you're shredding a document in law enforcement, you're supposed to be doing it pursuant to a document policy.
Let me walk you through why every detail in that report is important. First, the timing. Epstein died on August 10th, 2019. The shredding happened days after his death. Not weeks, not months, days. That is when an after-action team came into the jail, officially to investigate the circumstances of his death. Investigative teams do not shred documents. That is the opposite of what investigative teams do. Investigative teams collect evidence, preserve it, catalog it, because evidence is the entire point. This team was shredding. Second, the scale. A corrections officer called the FBI secret tip line and said they had never seen this amount of bags of shredded documents coming out. Never. In their career as a corrections officer. Never seen anything like it. This was not routine document disposal. This was not a standard records management process. This was an unusual, unprecedented volume of shredding happening in the days after the death of the most high-profile sex trafficking defendant in American history. Third, the method. They were handing bags of shredded material to an inmate to take to the rear gate, to throw in the dumpster. An inmate. In law enforcement, when you destroy documents pursuant to a retention policy, there is a process, a chain of custody, documentation of what was destroyed and why. You do not hand bags of evidence to an inmate and tell him to put them in the trash. The inmate noticed. The corrections officer noticed. They both found it so unusual that one of them called a secret FBI tip line. Both of them, people who work in that environment every day, said this was not normal. Fourth, what happened when it was reported? The U.S. Attorney's Office, according to emails in the Epstein files, acknowledged the shredding. Someone even suggested they might be able to recover the shredded documents. And then It was minimized, downgraded, referred to the Inspector General. The Inspector General writes reports. The Inspector General does not pursue criminal charges. The Inspector General cannot prosecute obstruction. So a potential obstruction of justice in the most significant sex trafficking case in American history was quietly handed to an office that can write a memo about it and nothing else. That is not an investigation. That is a burial.
You have a retention policy about what you keep, how long you keep it, how it's stored. So the mere fact that there's just this massive amount of shredding happening in and of itself is odd, because it's obviously not happening in the regular course of just a document retention policy. That you're handing them over to inmates to take out to the trash, and even the inmates going, this isn't normal. I mean, I don't even know what to say then. This stinks to high heaven.
And Molly, we've covered the jail part of this. Even if there is not documented foul play regarding Epstein's death, which is something that Congress now thinks is a valid question to investigate, we already know there were 2 corrections officers who were indicted and the charges later dropped. There were questions about malfeasance and hiding whether rules were broken. Again, even without foul play, you had a high-profile detainee, you failed to do the checks, there was video failure, there were other questions about financial misconduct. So as someone who's covered this story, when you look at this, that the government's first instinct was to hide tracks and basically destroy evidence, what does that tell you?
Yeah, look, it's the largest, if we just pull back for a minute, largest sex trafficking case that we know of, probably in American history. Todd Blanche says more than 1,200 victims, children, girls. And we have a government that at every point either acts suspiciously or acts negligently. At every point you have, they never searched Zorro Ranch. Huh? They didn't, with the dump of the documents, they're missing 302s. These, you have victims saying, I know I sat for interviews, where are they? Right? We have videos, we have transcripts, we have all sorts of stuff that we know is missing from the victims. We have Thomas Massey with a list of 230 names. Okay, that the victims have put together. So, I mean, it's just, there's so much smoke here. It's so suspicious. What? I mean, how is that possible?
And the U.S. Attorney's Office, we know from the Epstein files, had emails, as I mentioned in the setup, where they said, well, maybe we can go get the shredded docs, we can look at this. But ultimately, it was minimized over to the watchdog, the Inspector General, which does reports, but Maya, they don't actually pursue crimes, which means it was very quickly downgraded as not potential obstruction. Does that seem right to you or a problem?
Let me give you the full pattern. Because this is not just about the shredding. The shredding is one piece of a much larger picture. They never searched Zorro Ranch, Epstein's New Mexico property, one of the primary locations where trafficking allegedly occurred. The FBI never conducted a full search of that property. Victims said they sat for FBI interviews. Their interview summaries, their 302 forms, are missing. They know the interviews happened. They remember them. The documents do not exist. There is a list of 230 names that victims have provided, names of people they say were involved in Epstein's network. Those 230 names, not all of them have been publicly identified. Not all of them have been investigated. The surveillance footage from the night Epstein died, there were problems with that footage. The cameras outside his cell had technical failures. Both corrections officers assigned to watch him were asleep. He was taken off suicide watch despite prior attempts. And now, bags of shredded documents, days after his death, handed to an inmate to throw in a dumpster, reported to the FBI by 2 separate people who found it deeply suspicious, and then quietly handed to an office that cannot prosecute anyone for anything. At every single point in this case, the government either failed or acted suspiciously. The journalist said it plainly. At every point, you have the government acting either negligently or suspiciously. At every point. That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern. And here is what makes the current moment so critical. Half the Epstein files are still missing. The client list Bondi said was on her desk has never appeared. The 3 FBI interviews where a woman accused Trump of sexual assault when she was 13 were withheld until Congress demanded them. Powerful men's names are still redacted. Survivor names were published. And now we know, days after Epstein died, someone was in that jail shredding documents at a volume that shocked a career corrections officer. Those documents are gone. Whatever was in them, gone. Whatever names, whatever communications, whatever evidence was in those bags, destroyed and thrown in a dumpster by an investigative team that was supposed to be finding the truth. This is the largest sex trafficking case in American history. More than 1,200 identified victims. Girls, children, women whose lives were changed forever by what Epstein and his network did to them. And the government's response at every single step has been to make less information available, not more, less. Missing interviews, missing files, shredded documents, minimized investigations, redacted names, slow-walked releases. The survivors are still waiting for justice. They are still waiting for the names of the people who hurt them to be made public. They are still waiting for accountability that has been promised and delayed and minimized for years. And somewhere in a dumpster outside a federal jail in New York is whatever was in those bags. Share this video, because this story deserves to be told completely. Subscribe, new video every week. Drop a comment. Do you think we will ever find out what was in those shredded documents? Because based on everything we have seen, someone made sure we never would.